and it was for shoplifting. And I knew that the judge was not going to sentence him to jail. But each time, you know, they have the prosecutor, they ask the prosecutor if the prosecutor has sentencing recommendations. And I actually asked for 10 days in jail. I knew that he wasn't going to get it, but I asked for it. And I kind of wanted him to realize that this isn't acceptable and he could be facing jail. You know, he could actually go to jail. And they've actually done studies that demonstrates that if people go to jail for a short period of time, the first time that they go to jail, it actually acts as somewhat of a deterrent. Now you don't want them to be in jail forever, for a long time, then they get used to it. Having said that, I'm talking about first offenders type thing, or second offenders. So jail doesn't solve a lot of problems, but it can. Part of why we send people to prison is because it's punishment. I mean, it is punishment. But not everybody should be going to jail. I'm not for that, and I'm for programs that help people overcome it. I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-filing diversions that I don't agree with. It's happening at the county attorney's office. Pre-filing diversions is where they've got some program there where the sheriff's office will give them cases and they'll decide, well, they don't deserve jail, so we're going to go into this pre-filing diversion. And we won't charge them, and we'll tell them to go on rehab, and then if they successfully complete rehab and keep their noses clean, we'll never charge them. Okay, I don't like that, and I'll tell you the reason why. Because there's no accountability. There's no accountability by the offender, and quite frankly, there's no accountability by the county prosecutor's office, because these are all under the radar. The courts don't know where this is going. I mean, they're not monitoring this. And I would much rather charge them, which the rules contemplate, by the way, and even get a guilty plea, hold it in abeyance, which means that so they plead guilty, the court holds it in abeyance, and then the court said, and then we say, okay, now you go through the program, you're on the hook, you go through the program, and if you behave yourself, if you complete the drug rehab, if you keep your nose clean, then we dismiss the charges and it's off the record. And then if you don't comply, then we proceed to sentencing. That makes more sense to me because number one, now the defendant has skin in the game. There's a reason for him to comply. And also the county attorney, we don't have to rely on the good word of the county attorney as to whether or not they're being successful. The court oversees that. So I know that was well beyond your question.
So I know the incumbent enjoys the restorative justice side of the legal argument. My concern, and I just want your take on that. It seems as if he is taking the judge's role into his own hands. Because, like you said, the legislature passes laws, and then it's someone's job to enforce them, and that falls to the district attorney, and so he needs to then enforce the rules, and then it's at the judge's discretion whether or not to do whatever he wants to do, whether he gives jail time or whether he asks for an advance or whatever. And so by usurping that judicial authority, it would seem that we're kind of bypassing a step here.
Yeah, I agree 100% on that. And the example of the pre-filing diversion, I think, is one example. Also, his charging practices, his philosophy, and this is, I'm not in the office, but in my there, and also prosecutors that have left. Plea deal, and so. But they'll say, oh, we probably take a plea to 2 counts. But what they do is they charge those 2 counts, and they don't charge the other 4 counts. So what they're doing there is they're deciding at the charging stage what the appropriate plea is before they've really had a good chance to look at the evidence. And they're trying to do this restorative justice, you know, we're trying to be fair here. Okay, but I don't think there's anything fair about that. Because they're leaving the victim out of it as far as that, you know, their input, and they don't even know what the evidence is. I charge what the evidence supports, and then we work from there. And it's important that it's important not to bypass that process. It is true that the prosecutor has discretion in what charges to file, but oftentimes I get worried about when there's too much exercise of that discretion. And you certainly don't want to exercise that discretion before you have all the evidence, how you know your case is going to develop, you know, talking with victims, where they're going to be on the issue. And I think that's important. I think it bypasses that. The problem with restorative justice is we have an adversarial system. Okay, and basically now we have 2 defense attorneys in there. And we have a prosecutor that argues for justice. We have defense attorneys that argue for mercy. And then we have a judge that balances those 2 things and comes to a decision on sentencing. And that's how it needs to work. When you short circuit that and start playing defense attorney as well, then we have a failure in the system.
Yeah, we've heard a lot in the news over the last little while about a few other states. Their attorneys general have, made that latest statement, like we're not going to prosecute any of these statements, right? And that really has a bad effect on the morale of the police officers who are trying to make that happen. So what are you going to do to ensure that we maybe can keep that so the police officers know that if they spend the time and risk their life and all those things to get this person to go to be arrested, that it's going to follow through the court system?
Well, you know, one of the things that's important, you know, I've talked to police chiefs, I've talked to the sheriff, and it goes back to communication with law enforcement. I mean, they'll submit the case, and then they'll find out, they'll be notified at some point that that they're pursuing the case, or they'll just get a declination, we're not going to file charges. And law enforcement's left with, what's going on here? I don't know why. And one of the things that we do in our office, so we get appeals on a regular basis, and sometimes we'll get an appeal where we agree with the defendant that the court got it wrong. And so we'll confess error. But before we confess error, our policy is to call the district attorney or county attorney and say, look, we don't think that this is a valid ruling, and we're going to confess error. Tell us where we're wrong. And that's the same kind of, and then give them an opportunity to convince us that we've missed something or whatever. And that's the kind of system that I want in the county attorney's office. If we have a case and we conclude that there's not enough evidence there to support a charge, then we're going to be talking to the investigator and say, look, we don't believe that it supports a charge. And then we'll give that investigator an opportunity to point out things that perhaps we missed, or give that investigator an opportunity to continue his investigation and provide the evidence that we need. Sometimes we're going to disagree. Sometimes we will decline a charge, and law enforcement will disagree with us. That's going to happen. But if we have an open line of communication and we have a system where everybody has a voice in that process, we'll learn to respect each other.
Thank you.
How do we, respect people with mental health issues but still hold them accountable for crime they didn't commit?
There is a lot of that, and a lot of times when, and this mostly goes, if there's a mental health issue where it takes away the mens rea, okay, I'm talking legal talk, takes away the intent, all right, then they can't be prosecuted in court. But there's a lot where it doesn't necessarily take away their intent. And a lot of that has to be done through programs like, I talk about those that are sent to prison with those problems. There are programs to help them facilitate that. That's kind of out of our hands as a county prosecutor, but there are programs to help them with that. Now, the tougher question is with those that go to jail and oftentimes, as part of sentencing, if they're placed on probation, they're referred to mental health services so that they can get the help. I don't know if the criminal justice system is ever going to be equipped to solve those kinds of problems. I mean, we do the best that we can, and there are programs in place to help that. But it's a broader problem than what the criminal justice system can do. But we certainly try to.
Sometimes it seems like the victims of a crime really go through a lot of hardship in the process of prosecution, particularly if the defendant has a really aggressive attorney. Can you tell me what you've done to help the victims?
Well, one of the great resources that we all have is in the system is crime victim advocates. Okay, that specialize in helping victims. Now I'm going to have to follow up because I got some shakes in the head. So, but what their job is to do is help victims through that process. It's a tough process.
Who's enforcing them, their job?
What's that?
Who's enforcing that they're doing their job to do that?
Who's enforcing?
The advocates, the crime victim advocates are doing their job. Who enforces that? If they're not really doing their job.
Yeah, I can't speak to that. I know in my conversations with some victim advocates, their frustration has been that they're not getting notified like they should on a lot of these cases. And that, again, I'm going to go back to my experience in the Attorney General's office. Whenever there's an appeal filed, the first thing we do is complete a form that notifies them of the appeal, and then everything that we do, every filing that we get, we provide that to the crime victim advocate, and the crime victim advocate supplies that to the victim. And then if they want to talk to us, I mean, it's a tough process. I mean, it's horrible to go through that as a victim. I had a murder case that was up on appeal. And this guy is actually currently pending appeal. The victim, he was shot in the back, and supposedly by a supposed friend. And now it's on appeal. And so there's all the uncertainty that comes with that. And I had the opportunity to talk to the victim, and which I always do. Whenever the victim wants to talk to the attorney, I speak to him. And what's important is that they understand the process. So let's take a look at the appeal. All right, this is a long period of time. From the time that they first file a notice of appeal till we get a decision, it's going to be 2 years at least before they get a decision. And it's important that victims understand that wait, and it's also it's important that they understand what's going to happen if we win or if we lose. Because not all the time, I mean, because they're set scot-free. And, you know, and they, all the fear and everything else that they experience and outrage because, you know, they're afraid that person's gonna be let loose. And in most circumstances, it doesn't mean that. It means that there's gonna be a new trial. But in some circumstances, it does mean that that's the end of it. And it's important for victims to understand that, and it's important for prosecutors to make sure that they understand that. So we need to work with our victim advocates to make sure that they're, you know, hands-on with the victims. I am curious as to specifically what your concerns are.
Well, I guess it's just that a victim advocate is what I have experienced is somebody who keeps you informed of the process, but not somebody who necessarily navigates and helps you find resources and help for the problems that are brought to your front door by turning in a crime. When you turn in a crime and the state takes the case, but they kind of leave you to the side and say, we'll get back to you when we need you. When we're ready to use you as a chess piece, we'll let you know. But in the meantime, you're on your own. We're gonna go over here now, and your little victim advocate is gonna just send you the little links to the hearings. And when you have a problem, they're gonna say, I'm really busy today, I don't have time to talk to you. So when you're saying that you want to incorporate some more victims' rights or victims' programs, I'm just wondering, what are the details of that program? What does that look like for a victim? Because in my personal experience, I have pending cases against somebody who has strangled me and strangled my children, and I wish I would never have reported these crimes at this point. I wish I would never have reported these crimes. I've got 15 charges, felony charges against somebody, and I'm the one who's being treated like a criminal, and I'm the one who's in, my children and I are being terrified, and the state doesn't care, and the prosecutor's office doesn't care. And they said, oh, just contact your victim advocate. I can't even tell you how many times I've contacted a victim advocate and never received either phone calls back, help. It's just been like, stop annoying us. And I have very serious felony cases against somebody that could murder me, try to murder my kids.
Yeah.
I would just like to know what your plan is to do to help victims to not regret reporting crimes, so that your reporting of these very serious crimes against children and against people that have been strangled don't go down. Because you do have people like me that work in communities and talk to other people, and it creates a fear when they find out what's happened to you, that if that happens to me, I don't want to go through that.
Yeah.
And it really does come down to a balance between the state and the prosecutor's office trying to figure that out, because the victim is really a part of that case.
Right.
They have no help, and that's where I think my dad was trying to figure out, like, what are the recourses for somebody, and yes, attorneys are the ones who are kind of fighting these cases on both sides. We talk a lot about prosecution and defense, but the victims are really kind of just like a side issue.
Yeah.
Right? But without the victims, you have no cases.
Yeah. And
I'm sorry, that's a loaded question.
no,
You're talking to the right guy, because he's the one that's over that in the state.
You are talking to the right guy.
That's right.
You know, part of this process, you know, I've been on the appeal side, part of this process is helpful to me because it's an education to me. I'm gonna admit right now that I don't have all the answers to everything, but I care deeply. And that's why I'm in the race. And crime victim advocates should be more than just notice. At the appellate level, it's more about notice. At the district court level, you need to get them help, right? I mean, you need to get them help, and it can't just be, they've got to be willing to like sit down with you and go with you to court, go with you to whatever resources.
You're saying they should actually help you rather than
Right,
teach you the wolves?
right,
Teach you to the
right.
wolves. Because that's been my experience, has been literally fed to the wolves by the prosecutor's office and of course. the
Right.
court.
And I think that is often an overlooked thing by prosecutors. I'll tell you that right now. Because they're so involved in prosecuting the case, they forget that there's a victim involved.
Or allowing it to be continued out to the point where it's like the victim has just been completely obliterated in the process.
Yeah. And Brandon, I'm trying to remember Brandon's last name. I actually met with him, Brandon Merrill. And he's the executive director of Utah Homicide Services. And now that's specific to homicide cases, but what they do is they actually help the victims with all sorts of things to help them and provide the resources and get them the resources that they need. And so I had that conversation with him on that, and I think it needs to be extended to, and I think that's supposed to be the role, and it certainly be the role for our crime victim advocates in that office. And I appreciate that, because sometimes they just flat out, we get so narrowed in on prosecution, and at the end of the day, it's about victims and keeping the public safe and holding people accountable. And by the way, I walk towards the person. I'm basically deaf in my right ear, so I walk towards the person so that I can.
Well, I'm loud, so you won't have that problem. So my question is how are you going to assess the personalities? Because part of the problem in that office that some of us have observed from the inside and the outside is, one, you have all these prosecutors that see a drug case differently. You have a 16-year-old up the canyon, first time with pot, some are like, put him in jail, and some are like, whatever, slap on the wrist, let him go. The problem is you don't have time to assess that, but these are also the same prosecutors that end up being promoted after 7 or 8 years in the system that then treat these victims like that horribly. And instead what we do is we ask for 17, 20, 25 attorneys, and we still have 2 advocates on the sheriff's side and 2 on the attorney's side, and think that that's sufficient to cover an entire county, when the reality is what COVID and all these things have taught us is mental health and helping everybody is more important. So how do you assess that personnel and reshift that?
Well, first of all, I mean, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to meet with every attorney there. All right. And I know a lot of these attorneys, by the way. It's not like I'm a stranger to them because I handle their cases on appeal and so forth. I don't know them all, and a lot of times the interaction is over the phone. But first of all, I'm going to meet with attorneys and staff, by the way, and find out what works and what doesn't work. And they're also going to understand my prosecutorial philosophy on things. Which, you know, we charge what the evidence supports, et cetera, victims. And one of the things that, you know, he doubled the size of the prosecutors there. And that's actually one of the things that I started thinking about is like, do we really need that many prosecutors? I mean, I looked at the statistics. Crime has essentially been pretty much, it's gone up a little bit since he took office. And yet we're having fewer prosecutions in our district courts than we have before. And like, do we really need that many attorneys? Can we reallocate those resources? And I am not opposed at all to reallocating those resources. One part of that is training, and another thing, I mean, two victim advocates for the entire county, I think that is well understaffed. And we can put that money to better use. We can be more efficient in our prosecution and put that money to better use. And these are the things that I need to do to understand. So,
well, it's even worse than that. They don't even fund them in your own budget. What the previous attorneys have done is grant fund them, and so they wait for the federal government to give them $30,000 to get a half time, rather than taking care of the needs of the county. So that's really the question: is how do we reallocate those, and whether it's fire an attorney or whatever.
You know, now it is tough. I'll tell you right now, it's tough to fire attorneys and just to get rid of them because it's a merit system. But I don't even think they're fully staffed, even though they've got the funds now. And we had to work through that at the Attorney General's office. We never want to let somebody just go and leave them without a job. So a lot of times through attrition, we get rid of those positions. But I would like to see our funds allocated to where they're needed the most. And I would imagine, and I don't know your experience, I would imagine that the crime victim advocates, and I don't know who they are in the present county attorney's office, but I would imagine that they feel overwhelmed.
They are 100%.
Yeah. And so, and they're part of the people that I'm talking to about what do we need, okay? What's working, what's not working. And I have secretarial staff at the Attorney General's office, and we're always listening to them. I mean, I go back to the Criminal Appeals Division, because so much works so well. It's a good office, and we have very, I mean, I've got a very liberal friend from Massachusetts that's part of it, and we don't see eye to eye on anything except prosecution. But it's important to have those relationships, and we talk. And the secretaries, if they're saying, we're having problems with this, we bend over backwards to make sure that their job is easier. And I think it's important that any office work that way. We're all a team, including victim advocates, and that sounds terribly understaffed for that. Because there are tons of resources out there for victims, but we need the people that are able to.
You'd be surprised at the experience I've had trying to find and tap into resources over the last 18 months. It has been so overwhelming that not one single agency will literally even give you the time of day because they're so overwhelmed with the amount of caseload and they're just literally like your number to them. And that's what Phil's doing or doing with the prosecutor's office and with them. And so it is very disingenuous to feel that you have put everything into their faith into them, and then you are just literally thrown to the wayside and fed to the wolves and saying, but when we need you, we're going to make sure you're going to testify for our case for the win. And it's really just, I think that you have a very huge disconnect right now. So I came to this meeting after we said you were going to restore victim programs because I wanted specifically to hear what really is going to happen. Right now, I would probably take a go for it and stand on the street and say, do not ever turn in anybody for domestic violence. You will regret it every day. You will not only regret it, you will pay a price. That person will retaliate against you, and they will use all their legal knowledge and their legal resources to obliterate the crap out of you. And you will be standing alone, not even your prosecutor, who's your officer against you. So that's what I would probably do at this point, and I don't want to feel that way, and I didn't feel that way when I first went to leave. And this is the way it's working. This is something that this is called, this is a choice. I mean, to go to report this and ask the state for the help that I need it. So it just feels very, a huge betrayal from the way that the system is set up to kind of disregard victims for who they really are and what brought that case forward. So the victims, you have no cases. And I just think that has become a huge oversight. Victims are victims, it doesn't mean they're weak and they're stupid. It just means that they have something bad happening to them and they need the resources the same as a defendant.
Right.
The defendant has healing resources, and it's advocate for this. Victims have to go and research and dig and fight. The victim's already been fighting, to get whatever's happened to them heard. They shouldn't have to fight also for the resources to stay protected, and that's what I think is lacking in my experience. I'm not sure that's your experience, but I just was very interested in your victims.
And, I had a good friend that was the victim of violent sexual assault. And, it's, can I say sex? She was a victim of violent assault. He almost killed her. And if it wasn't for her. And, you need counseling. She would come to me and talk about maybe trying to mend the relationship. And I'm like, no. This man almost killed you. And you need that. And I'm disturbed to see how understaffed we are. And I think we can.
It eliminates protection, is what it does. It eliminates people caring about your level of protection while you are in a pre-trial situation.
Right.
And that's where I think that has been my experience, and then I've talked to other people just by default, and when I find out that's been their experience too, I'm saying, well, gosh, it's not just like I fell through the cracks, it must be a problem.
Well, I would like to talk to you more afterwards, so.
Kind of along in that same area, when I was looking at your thing you sent out, you talked about restoring the special victims unit, and then, said that David Levitt disbanded it, and he signaled to everyone that sex crimes are not a priority, and he said, I will not let that stand in bold. And then it says, if you're sexually abusing someone, if you are taking or trading in pictures of children, I will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. Now, I think most everybody can agree that that's what needs to happen. However, if you've ever had a teenager, you know that they're sending images to their friends and their girlfriends and their boyfriends, and that's just what they do. And, I mean, half the kids at Tisky are probably doing it. So, how do you, that is child pornography distribution and, solicitation. How do you view that? Is there any nuance in your mind?
Well, you
Because
know,
I'm just saying this
yeah.
because I can see a 16-year-old kid's life destroyed if he has to be listed as a sex offender and he just happened to be chosen, the Hunger Games.
Right.
When all the kids are doing it.
Well, I mean, one concern there is the bullying, if the,
Well, sure.
you know,
But I
so,
don't know
but
if you'd say
if
that
they're
boyfriends
juveniles,
are bullying each other. I'm just saying.
we also prosecute in juvenile court.
Yeah.
And the juvenile system, they're still charged. I believe in accountability. I think there needs to be accountability and intervention. I'm not gonna shy away from that kind of case. They go into the juvenile system, and the juvenile system is designed, it's not a criminal proceeding, all right? They charge them with the crime, like third-degree felony if charged as an adult. And then they go through the system, and it's designed to help the child. I mean, they're not going to prison, they might go to detention, but they do everything they can, okay, to help juveniles overcome this.
Yeah.
And so, it's not a perfect system, but it really tries, and there's a few cases where they're charged as adults.
Yeah.
But that's usually like homicide and so forth.
Well,
That kind of
I
thing.
just talked about something that, in my mind, like I said, I think there's a huge percentage of our teen population just doing that with their phones. It's just part of their world, and I would imagine most of them have no concept that that's a felony. No idea.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any way you can probably lessen your load for your prosecutors in that if maybe there was some sort of outreach to the high schools, and now it's probably unionized to say, hey kids,
Yeah.
you need to know what this is before you think it's this innocent thing between boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever. It's
Right.
not innocent at all. I just, have family members that have been affected by this and have people's lives could have been destroyed for doing something that really, I mean, you just gotta know all the kids are doing.
Were they charged?
Almost. If they admitted to it, then they let it go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I mean, if they didn't admit to it, then a court case and a lot of drama and scene and things about the whole world.
Cases like that, I mean, there is prosecutorial discretion as to whether or not it's appropriate. And what, you have to look at a lot of factors. I mean, if there's bullying involved, then I would be more inclined to charge, okay? But if it was like a consensual type thing, then I'm not as likely to. As far as outreach, I mean, the best outreach, I mean, you gotta talk to Sheriff Smith and the police chiefs, because we have those officers, and we can do a lot of good, in that setting. And that's not necessarily over the purview of the county attorney, but I'd certainly be willing to be a partner in that kind of thing. I think it is important. I've thought about that as my own son. It's like, he needs to understand how serious it is, for example, child pornography. Feds, child pornography, it's 20 years to life.
I mean, obviously, even a teenager who's 16, some kids would know that looking at a 8-year-old person, that's child pornography. They don't think that if they ask for something from a 16-year-old girlfriend, that's also child pornography. And that's where I think the education needs to happen. And I just hate to think that young people's lives are being ruined over something that sadly, culturally, is just
Yeah.
kind of what's done.
Yeah. So I would support all, as far as education, that's very helpful. I'm a big believer in, you tell your kids what to expect, what they're gonna face, and what the consequences of things are. And because that helps steel them against a lot of those things. But, consensual situations, there's a lot more exercise of prosecutorial discretion among that. But there's also cases that it's appropriate to charge. So, okay, I've got helpers here. Who was first?
Yeah. So, taking this position would obviously make you a public figure, right? And as a public figure, it means you're going to be open to scrutiny, which also means you're going to be open to the possibility of groups coming after you if you take a tough on crime stance. If you have groups attack you and try to get you to change your mind, what is your philosophy on being able to stand up to that and continue with your principles?
I'm going back so people on the camera can see me. Thank you. My philosophy is pretty steeled in my 30 years of prosecutorial experience. People may come after me. That's not to say that I'm open to listen to people. I don't have all the answers of everything, but I don't believe in what they're doing in LA or Chicago or New York. That's not my philosophy, and that's my experience tells me it doesn't help. And I don't care, they can come at me with all they want. People need to be held accountable. And one of the things that David Levitt talks about, he wants to help people. That's great. I want people to succeed as well. But you have to take accountability. There has to be accountability. And if there's no accountability, then people are just going to run over you. It's kind of like the riots that we see across the country in the past couple of years. And it's like we're going to let them do property damage as long as they don't injure somebody. Well, the problem with that is, as soon as you allow that kind of crime, it just spreads. And property damage, by the way, is not very, that's not a victimless crime. People suffer as a result of that. I believe, we had an issue in Provo where somebody got mobbed by a demonstration and then actually got fired at with a gun. And what upsets me about that is that they had no right, a law-abiding citizen trying to make his way through the streets, and I'm cracking down on that. That's not going to be acceptable. Now, if they want to demonstrate, if they want to get a permit and block off a street, that's their right. But as soon as they start violating the law, then we need to prosecute that. That's not acceptable. We're in a civilized society. We believe in the rule of law. I believe in the rule of law. And when we start making exceptions here and there, so, how am I going to do that? I'm going to stand up to it. It's my core belief. Okay. It's up to Dad here.
I found it interesting that you said we have more prosecuting, we have a ton of attorneys, more attorneys than feeling need, and fewer cases than at other times. And yet, the prosecutors are not prepared when it comes, they don't prepare until 1 or 2 weeks before, they have all year, a year and a half to prepare. And then when it comes, we've had 3 pre-trial hearings and a final hard date set, and the prosecuting attorney was not prepared, and he left it in without anything. He's pushed out, and I just want to know, what are you going to do, and how can you make a difference to say these cases, we are going to be prepared, and we are going to keep our promises and we're going to we're gonna get the job done, instead of keep pushing things out, simply because you're not prepared.
We talked about accountability, I think that's what she's on.
So, one of the things, I think, okay, and this gets back to having attorneys that are experienced to prosecute these cases. And so, and I'll just give the example, again, the Special Victims Unit, which I think would fall under the purview. We've got 2-year attorneys sometimes that are prosecuting those cases. They're not going to be prepared because they don't have the experience, and even if they're 10-year attorneys or 15-year attorneys, if they're not trained and experienced in it, they're not going to be prepared. And so we have to have those attorneys. Specialization, it's nice to be a generalist if you're doing misdemeanor cases or most misdemeanor cases, but when you're starting to get into the more difficult cases, the sexual assaults, the murders and so forth, you better have experienced attorneys. And if you don't have them, you can always call, like for example, a lot of communities don't have attorneys that really are prepared to prosecute like homicide cases. And the Attorney General's office is a resource where they have attorneys that are experienced in those things can do that. But one of the things that when I discovered this, I'm talking about reallocating resources, and you make a good point about those victim advocates, but I also would like to funnel some of that money and resources to training, and that's something that I specifically talked about. Even if we can, whether it's by attorneys within the office that are their responsibilities to help in training, that's going to help a lot and getting ready. I mean, it's just, they're so far backlogged in cases that they're screening that they can't do the job of prosecuting. And that needs to change. We need to streamline that process. Right now, it's a 9-member team, and all but one is inexperienced that are screening cases, and they're just getting backlogged and backlogged. We need to streamline that, and once we streamline that, then we can start taking care of the cases that have been filed.
I was just gonna say, like, a lot of this is the non-communication between the district attorney's office and what's happening with the sheriff's office. If you go talk to Mike Lee, he'll tell you all about it. He'll also tell you how they're super underfunded in every city. When there are cases that end up getting pushed through, the city doesn't have the resources to provide the evidence to the district attorney's office, and so they're all going to the county, who doesn't have the resources to do all of the evidence building. And so when you're like, hey, the attorney isn't preparing the case until 2 weeks before, yeah, because the evidence isn't put together until 2 weeks before. And so it's like, hey, here's a hard day when we're going to court. I need the stuff so that the information that exists for the attorneys to put together a case for a year, because the evidence is backlogged, because every organization is backlogged, because we live in a county that doesn't want to spend money, and so we.
For the middle person that actually connects and is the glue that holds both.
Yeah, it's both sides together. So the linchpin that we have that kind of facilitates all of that is horrible that we have right now. So we're trying to make that change and streamline all those things. So I know Jeff's not there right now, but
Yeah.
right.
Well, and you know, that's yeah, and again, that is why I need to sit down. That's why there needs to be communication on all levels. And my experience is if you don't have that, and everything I'm being told is that we don't have that, it's obvious, and that needs to change.
My question is about
Okay, go ahead.
well, Mr. Levitt's name is in the news a lot, mostly for bad, but nevertheless, his name is
Yeah.
in the news. And sometimes I think when people go to vote, they just, oh, I recognize that name, I'll vote for that. How do you intend to overcome that?
Well,
What's your strategy?
yes, raising lots of money, to be honest with you. I mean, because, one of the things we've done, it's not necessarily popular among many delegates, is we've tried to gather signatures. And, whether or not we actually accomplish that, I don't know. It's tough. He's hired people to do it, and I don't have those kinds of resources at this stage. but, you know, we're raising funds and we need to get our name out there. But the signature gathering process is a start, you know, because, you know, you look around and you start, you know, and people don't know, right? I mean, you never heard of me. I've taken 2 cases to the US Supreme Court. You've never heard of me. Okay, I'm probably the only attorney in the state of Utah that's done that at this, and I'm not bragging. I'm just, the point is, you've never heard of me, and everybody's heard of Levin. As my wife, she's gone through, and there's very few Levin supporters. He seems to be doing a lot of the at least the anti-Levin thing for me, and I haven't had to do anything. He's in the news for all the wrong reasons. But she's come across a few, and I always ask her, did they mean Mike Levitt or did they mean David Levitt that they like? So, so that is, and so we're getting I'm holding these, I'm doing cottage meetings, and we're doing everything we can to get our name out there, and of course we need help. I'm not independently wealthy like the Levitts. I've been a public servant my entire life. And so I'm not independently wealthy, and I can't do it myself. But I can do it with the help of those that support me, and we're doing everything we can. I need my campaign manager is telling me.
So we have a couple of questions online that would like to be asked.
Okay.
So the first one is about civil asset forfeiture. Can you tell us any of your knowledge on civil asset forfeiture and whether you believe that it's being abused in Utah or not?
Okay. So I actually, as an appellate attorney, haven't had to deal with asset forfeiture for a lot, so I'm actually doing some study on it. And the concern is the due process issue, is because for those that don't know what asset forfeiture is, and maybe everybody does, but it's a civil proceeding where we take, for example, the instrumentalities of crime. And you don't necessarily have to be convicted of the crime before we do that. And this proceeding actually dates back till before the Constitution. So it's something that actually our framers understood. Now there are some concerns about its misuse, but under Utah law, for number one, we require clear and convincing evidence. And it's the state that has to prove that it was an instrumentality of a crime. All right, it's the state that has to prove that. And under U.S. Supreme Court precedents, all that is required is a preponderance of the evidence. So it's actually a greater burden. It doesn't rise to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's clear and convincing evidence. On the other hand, if a defendant is subsequently acquitted, okay, of the crime, then under state law, the property has to be returned. So that's a critical safeguard in that process. But basically, the reason behind it is we don't believe, under state law, that people ought to benefit from the exploits of their crimes. You shouldn't be able to profit from crime, and so that's what it's doing. And again, I'll admit that's something I have to study up more on. But my own studies and under state law, there is that safeguard: is if you're acquitted of the crime, the state has to return the property.
What about so we have a few more, so I'm going to ask just 2 of them at least.
Okay.
The second one is, let me read it. It says the U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but has 25% of the world's incarcerated. What are your thoughts, and do you believe in alternatives to incarceration?
I believe people should be punished for their offenses. If there's other alternatives, let's examine those. I'm never opposed to looking at things, but I believe that alternatives. Some people simply, they need to pay the price. You do the crime, you pay the price. And we should invest in programs in prison to help prisoners so that they, when they get out, they don't reoffend. And it really comes down to accountability. I mean, if it's community service, then great. I mean, community service, you know, we have in Salt Lake, we have taggers that do all this graffiti and so forth. And I think the best thing that we can do for them is make sure that they make them clean up the graffiti and so forth. So there are other things, and I'm never opposed to looking at other, but under our system now, again, under any system, quite frankly, sometimes you just have to do the time. And if there's not a price to be paid, then people will continue to offend.
So I'll throw a question again, kind of with asset forfeiture. How do you feel, and how would you want used, if at all, no-knock warrants?
Okay. I think this can be misunderstood in a lot of ways. I know that people are concerned about, you know, the militarization of police. But one of the examples that they give, and this is kind of close to my heart, law enforcement, they're in such a tough job. And it's easy for us to say, oh, they shouldn't have done a no-knock warrant, or they shouldn't be all vested up and everything. Well, you know who they're dealing with. They're dealing with people that are armed to the teeth. And we had a case in Ogden, I believe it was, and this is used as the poster child, by the way, of no-knock warrants. That was a knock and announce warrant. This was an officer who, or police, they had a search warrant for the home, and it was a knock and announce, and the guy was dealing drugs, actually manufacturing drugs, I believe, and they knocked and announced, and they waited for so much time, and then they entered. Well, while they're waiting, okay, because they knock and they yell police, and while they're waiting, he's barricading himself in, and so when police entered, he shot and killed the police officer. If it would have been a no-knock, okay, he wouldn't have had that opportunity. Now, no-knocks are the exception, and they should be the exception. But under constitutional law, all right, if you have a basis to believe that they are armed and dangerous and represent that, then you can do the no-knock. And in those cases, it's appropriate.
As a follow-up to that, in that exact example in Ogden, they weren't vested up and they didn't see him as a high threat because it was low level. And that changed some of the protocols, and so that same kind of poster child, like, look, we used no-knock here, we did knock, is that all the indications that it wasn't high threat. And that's why they were just like, oh, we're just coming to serve this warrant, we think you're home.
Yeah.
And so I guess would that be the opposite of like, hey, we want to follow constitutional laws?
Well,
because all the indications didn't say he was going to arm up and put up an armed resistance.
Yeah, and I don't know the specific facts. What I do know is that he was manufacturing, and generally those that are making drugs, I don't think it was simple drug use, because usually we're not doing law enforcement's usually looking for dealers when they go in to search houses, but they did knock, and that gave them the opportunity. And they do have to make the showing that they're possible. And sometimes the crime itself provides what you need to show that they're armed. For example, like a simple drug user is not going to be, there's not necessarily a basis to believe that they're going to be armed. But somebody that's dealing and so forth, there's a lot more likelihood. But they need to be appropriate, and it needs to be under circumstances that the state, and they just created a law, the state has to make a showing that the person represents, it could be armed and dangerous and represent a threat. And if they make that showing, then I think they're appropriate. If they don't make that showing, then not necessarily. Now, some folks will say, well, why can't they just wait until, you know, the guy's out on the street or whatever? Well, then you have a whole other issue where you're jeopardizing the safety of people, of the public. So there's a lot of those issues.
Back to the forfeiture laws, you know what red flag laws are, right?
Yeah.
Are you in favor of those?
No.
Okay.
No. And I will admit that most of those red flag laws are federal laws, which I'm actually not aware of state red flag laws. So that's something that we need to address with Senator Lee and Senator Romney. But I'm trying to focus on prosecution. But yeah.
Well,
yeah.
you can have a Fed agent try to come through your front door and pick up some guns.
Yeah.
Okay? Do you have any recourse if that were to happen?
I don't, as county attorney, no. No.
Like a baseball bat to his head?
We'll support you.
Yeah. Okay, it seems worrisome about, there seems to be a shift of kind of what's happening across our country and in Utah where like parents were labeled domestic terrorists, and so this same time about over 10 parents were criminally charged for trying to attend our school board meetings, and then our good friend last week was just thrown out of the Capitol for a sticker, but they made up a new rule so you can't have a sticker, and he was physically thrown out with, like, handcuffed, drug out. I'm like, I'm worried about the shift in who we're targeting as our officers are, and do you think how do we help them understand like our constitutional rights need to be protected versus, because they were put in an awkward position last year where they're throwing people out for not wearing a mask and things that are like unprecedented things. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. Now we're getting into politics that we don't
Constitutional rights
doesn't necessarily address, but one of my biggest concerns is as a citizen. All right, I think our freedom of speech is being assaulted, and I think that's the most dangerous thing that can happen in this country. I'm really concerned about that, and as far as and that's something we need to do everything we can as citizens to make sure that doesn't happen. Once we start chilling free speech, that's when, that's the very basis that this country was founded under, is the freedom of speech. And the answer to free speech, or the answer to false speech, isn't censorship, it's more speech. And we make our arguments through discourse. And that's, I hate that. And as far as you mentioned mask mandates, I'm opposed to that. It troubles me that. Now, I will say that if a local business decides that they want, whatever they do, that's their private entity, and they can choose to do, to accept whoever they want and make the rules. But as far as the government's concerned, at the federal level especially, I don't think President Biden has any authority whatsoever to mandate vaccines or anything like that.
What about the health orders related to COVID-19? Like, assuming we have more restrictions come back after the midterm elections. We saw the Halloween party get prosecuted on Utah Lake by David Levitt for people violating the county health orders. Do you support that kind of prosecution?
That troubles me. This was, and I don't know all the facts, I've got to admit. But I'm also concerned, I don't want, as county attorney, I'm concerned about imposing my ideas, my sense of personal justice, and usurping those that legislatively, okay? So, I have to be very careful in, picking and choosing what I feel like I can prosecute, if that makes sense.
I agree with that. Can I just follow up though, because if it's a county health ordinance, but it hasn't been legislatively passed.
What's that?
If it hasn't been passed by legislature, it's not technically a law, right? So how do you, that's, I think where the line comes. If
That's
it's a
not
health
true.
ordinance,
I
right?
mean, we have ordinances that they, and we do have ordinances. I mean, we have state laws that govern the state. We have county ordinances, which are also laws, municipal ordinances, which are also laws. Now, one of my jobs as the county attorney is to review stuff that the county puts out and make determinations as to whether it's constitutional. So I have grave concerns about the constitutionality of that, and if I conclude that it's not constitutional based on the law, then that's something that I would step in and I haven't personally examined this, so I don't want to say one way or the other whether it's constitutional or not. One thing, I'm a lawyer, and I'm not going to make a decision on the law until I research the issues. And it hasn't come across my desk, but it does raise concern for me. So, I mean, quite frankly, on a case like that, and again, I think prosecutors have to be careful about the discretion that they use, but that doesn't sound like a case that I would want to pursue. So
going back to my earlier question, this will fall into exactly what you're saying. Unfortunately, you do have a civil and a criminal division that you're
Yes.
responsible for.
Yes.
Civil division is assigned by the county attorney. Well, currently we have civil division attorneys in there that are good people. But talking about legislating from there, this is the same group that you appoint somebody to sit with the Board of Health, and they bring up issues, and they are creating issues to prevent future legal things, which in my opinion is an infringement on our freedoms. The other problem is this is a group that literally, the same men that you would be over, have brought to the commission, because we voted it down, to prevent protesting on property of the county historic courthouse. So these are the same type of people. So going back to my other question, how do you assess these people so that you can review and decide who you're going to put in front of these things, and what's, I guess, your litmus test? Because from the health department to the sheriff's department to having attorneys helping them to make sure they're serving and protecting the citizens of Utah County, how are you going to go about
well, so luckily, okay, I have been on that side of it. It's been a long time when we represented, the northern Utah County cities. So I have been on that side. It's been a long time, so it's not necessarily my specialty, but I'm a fast learner. And I also want to bring in people that I trust, that understand the law, and that can examine these things. So we do have attorneys, and they're going to have to justify it to me when they make those decisions. Those tend to be, hotly debated issues that come before, and if they need legal counsel, we need to examine that. And they need to bring the law to me to convince me one way or the other. I'm an appellate attorney. By the way, when the county attorney office in prosecution cases, when they have a question about the law and about how to proceed with the case, they call our division. We take calls like that all the time. Now, on the civil side, they're going to have to justify it to me and show that there's a legal basis for what is being done or not done.
So we have a question about the SVU unit and whether you agree with the fact that it was shut down, whether you would reinstate it, and kind of what you believe about that unit.
What I will what?
What you believe about that unit.
Okay.
We touched on that a little bit at the beginning. There's a lot of people kind of coming on near the end.
So just real quickly, that's one of the things that prompted me to join the race. It was wrong to eliminate it, Now, I've been told by some, for some reasons, nothing that Levitt has said publicly that I've heard of. But you don't, I mean, even if there were issues within the SB, within that unit at the time, you don't just throw out the unit. You fix the problem, whatever problem there may have been. You don't just throw out the unit. That was a mistake. That was a mistake to eliminate the SB. And I'm speaking to one delegate that I had a conversation with, in case people are confused. But that was a horrendous mistake. We need qualified, trained, and experienced prosecutors that work with our investigators that are working those cases. And when we don't do that, I mean, another thing that they're not doing, I've been told, is they're not enhancing those crimes. Okay, and an enhancement is when, if you're in a position of special trust, like a brother or like a stepfather or dad or boyfriend, teacher, and you perpetrate child sex abuse, under Utah law, you enhance the crime and they're subject to stiffer penalties, greater prison sentences. And that, in many instances, is not happening. So we need to restore that unit so that we're working together with law enforcement so that we're streamlining the process with attorneys that know what they're doing.
So the special victims unit that you're talking about, how are they trained differently than other attorneys in the office? Because I heard that Levitt spreads attorneys around in different departments. He still prosecutes, but the attorneys aren't as specialized.
Right. Well, I mean, take a look at your own life experiences. You don't call a plumber, to do the wiring, all right? And if you think that any old attorney can do something, people come to me all the time, like friends, and want advice on, landlord, tenant, or property, or whatever. It's like, I'm not the guy to talk to, okay? The last time I learned about that was in law school, which was too long ago. And so I need to refer you to somebody. And law is no different. The law is no different. You need specialized attorneys. You don't want somebody that only has experience in DUIs prosecuting child sex abuse. It's a world apart. It's a world apart. So you train them. And that goes back to how I want to allocate my resources.
I think it goes without question that the current Utah County attorneys had strained relations. We've already talked about victims, and specifically the SVU. I'd love to hear how you would say you would try and reach out with the law enforcement officers. Because we personally talk and know quite a few, and they say they're very, very hesitant because of the relations that have been strained now.
Right.
And specifically, we know some who are in leadership, they said we'd never want our name out because if it got back to Levitt, it can negatively affect them. So I'd love to hear how you would address, hey, this is how I want to work with law enforcement and strengthen those relationships.
Well, I think the first way to do that is talk with law enforcement and regularly meet with law enforcement. I mean, I said earlier, and I guess I go to my own experiences, when I train law enforcement officers in search and seizure law, it's a discussion with them where I learn as much as they do. One thing that I've learned as a prosecutor is I can't begin to understand what law enforcement faces. Okay, I'm not on the front lines, all right? They are. And I can't begin to understand what they're facing and some of the issues, some of their knowledge, all right? I don't understand that unless I'm talking with them. And I'm going to do that on a regular basis. I'm going to train officers on a regular basis. And when I say train, it's almost always a two-way process. because I learn as much from the officers as the officers do from me. My wife, she says that I'm the only person that she knows that will randomly go to a police officer and start asking him questions. One time there was they had a drug dog out at Harmon's in West Jordan, and I'm like, okay, I deal with this every day. And so I took my family home, grabbed my Attorney General badge, went back, approached the officer, and he was kind of like, what in the heck are you asking me? But anyway, because I wanted to learn what they were doing and see from their viewpoint. And I don't have that viewpoint. One of my best friends was a lieutenant with the sheriff's office. And I like to bounce questions off of him so that I understand where he's going. And I know that there's a fractured relationship. I think if you look at Ken Walentine is he's president of the Utah Chiefs of Police Association. And he has endorsed me. And he talked about, sometimes we disagree. We disagree on stuff, but I treat him as an equal, he treats me as an equal, and I learn. And I think, even though there may be disagreements, I think what you will know from me is that I want to talk to you, I want to understand law enforcement, and I want to help law enforcement do their job. I mean, I took 2 cases to the U.S. Supreme Court. They were both law enforcement cases. That's the lengths I'm willing to go to support law enforcement when they're in the right. And I think they'll learn to know that. It's so easy to sit there and say, well, why did the officer shoot this person under these circumstances? And, everybody's quick to jump on law enforcement on those things. And, the one case, and I don't remember, it was in Minnesota where the guy's reaching in for they don't know what. I mean, first of all, they had him down and he got up, and now he's reaching for something. And law enforcement's supposed to think, oh, it's okay. I mean, how do you know it's a gun? They don't know it's a gun. But if it is a gun, they're going to turn it on law enforcement, and then they're dead. And one of the things that, I'll be honest, when I've trained officers, there was one case where they had to throw out the evidence, or they didn't have to. I lost in the Utah Supreme Court on a case, and they said the officers didn't have a basis to believe that the guy was armed and dangerous. And they searched the vehicle, and they threw out the evidence. At the end of the day, in my opinion, if the officer feels threatened, I would rather lose the evidence. I would rather have that officer lose the evidence than lose his life. He's got a family every bit as much as any of us do. And it's easy for our courts or any of us to sit back and second guess what an officer does. And that doesn't mean you don't train them and what's right and what's wrong. But at the end of the day, they've got the toughest job I can imagine.
I'm a very high supporter of law enforcement, and those guys keep picking up what they do. My question is, are you involved, would you be involved in cleaning up disruption that sometimes exists within the county?
Like within law enforcement?
Yeah.
So sometimes law enforcement doesn't do the right thing, and you have to make tough calls. And I absolutely have no problem doing that. Like I told at the beginning, we don't need law enforcement lying, and if they are, that's going to be addressed with the sheriff. I mean, I'm not over law enforcement, so but if I have concerns, I'm going to the sheriff. I mean, I was just talking to the sheriff yesterday, and he talked about a situation where there was a claim that an officer was lying, but they wouldn't tell him. The county attorney's office would not tell him what the issue was. And it's like, how can that make any sense whatsoever? I mean, how can that make any sense? That needs to be addressed, and it handcuffs the sheriff from addressing the situation. And, you know, whether it was true or not, I mean, he's got to have that ability. And so one of the things that disturbs me, quite frankly, is the length of time that it takes for the county attorney's office to make a decision on these officer misconduct claims. All right, so we had a case, and this officer was ultimately charged, but it took him 11 months and a referral to another county, all right, before charges were filed. Now, when you take that long, this doesn't help anybody. All right, this doesn't help anybody, and there's three things. One, it's not fair to the person who's allegedly wronged by the police officer to wait all that time to see whether or not they're vindicated. It's not fair to the officer who's left in limbo and on administrative leave, okay, for all that time. And it's not fair to the public, because what the public can see, this is part of the problem that we've had with some of the challenges, for as a nice term, but some of the riots and so forth, because they've lost trust in government and whether or not they're really being, whether or not they're honest with them. I mean, there was a case in Chicago where it didn't come to light for 2 years, what they were doing. And so people are going to get upset because they're thinking that it's being brushed under the rug. So I think it's bad on all fronts, to the officer, to the person that's alleging a wrong, and also to the public. And I would like to see those cases. We just passed a law, I think, in this past legislative session that requires a statement within 6 months. And I would like to make that 3 months. Now, I understand that some of these things can take longer. If it's going to take longer, we're going to make a statement why it's going to take longer. But as a general rule, I would like to see a decision on those cases within 3 months. We need to put resources into that and make a decision. And sometimes that'll be a tough decision. And sometimes it will require a referral to another county to make sure that everything is fair. But these things need to be expeditiously and thoroughly investigated and not leave everybody in the lurch.
So I'm going to ask one last question from online. We did promise the library that we would end by 8:45 because the library does close at 9 o'clock. So I'm going to give you one last question and then let you wrap up a little bit. What would you do with repeat offenders, especially when it comes to those with mental illness that are repeat offenders?
So, again, repeat offenders, I'm prosecuting those cases, and I'm probably asking for prison time if it's in the case of a felony. It's really an issue at that point that we need resources in our prisons and so forth to help with those issues. I wish there was a magic bullet on that. I don't have the answers. I don't have all the answers, unfortunately. I do believe we need to hold people accountable, and repeat offenders, we're going to prosecute. We're going to charge with the evidence supports and go from there. That doesn't mean that we're not open to ways to provide help. Again, as a misdemeanor prosecutor, we often refer them as part of probation to mental health. And I know that those same services are in prison. But it's so much bigger than the criminal justice system. At some point, we need to address that as a society and as families, to be honest with you. I mean, oftentimes, we always look to the government for all the answers. And my experience is that the best solution for people and the best chance they have is when they have strong families. So. Any other questions?
So why did you decide to run? Because it's such a mess and you have such a good job running.
You know, I'm asking myself that. No, because I care. I care, and I feel like I have the experience that will help me, that will make this county a better county, that will have a better prosecutor's office. I truly do care. I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't. You know, I've often thought, you know, it'd be a lot easier to, you know, retire in a couple of years, enjoy my grandchildren, as they grow, and hopefully we have more. But it's important. I believe in this country. I love this country. I love this community, and I want to make a difference. That's why I ran. I want to make a difference. And this is the culmination of my career, not the beginning of it. People have asked me, are you going to run for Attorney General? No. County attorney, I want to make my last job. So, anyway. All right, thank you. I appreciate it.
And he's my little brother, and he's a good guy.